The sun rose over the desert, painting the sand in pale gold hues, the heat already pressing against the soldiers as they moved in a tight formation across the barren terrain. Sergeant Harper led the squad, her eyes scanning every ridge and dip, her hand hovering near her rifle. The radio crackling softly with distant commands. Their mission was clear: secure the route and gather intel. But something in the air felt wrong. The silence heavy, broken only by the crunch of boots on sand and the faint whistle of the wind through distant rocks. Harper adjusted her helmet, her heart pounding. She could feel the desert watching, waiting. The squad moved cautiously, each soldier alert to the faintest sound, every shadow a potential threat. The air smelled of dust and oil and something metallic that made her stomach twist. She signaled the team to stop crouching low, her eyes scanning the horizon for movement. A glint caught her attention. A small piece of metal half buried in sand. She froze, the hair on her neck standing on end. The faintest click sounded beneath her boot. She stepped back instinctively, but it was too late. The ground erupted in fire and smoke, a deafening blast tearing through the air. Harper was thrown forward, her legs crushed. Beneath the debris, pain exploding through her body, screaming tearing from her throat as her world turned chaotic. Her vision blurred. She could barely focus on the wreckage around her teammates thrown across the sand, dust choking her lungs. She felt the heat of flames licking nearby shrapnel cutting through her uniform. The team scrambled, trying to reach cover. Some injured others pinned down. Harper could hear them shouting her name and the cries of men she had trained with the sound. Almost drowned out by ringing in her ears, she tried to move her legs, but nothing responded. Agony radiating from her lower body, the metal and sand beneath her refusing to budge. Panic clawing at her chest. Through the haze, she saw Corporal James, crawling toward her, his face smeared with blood and grit, reaching out to her. Harper shook her head. "No, I cannot move," she gasped. Voice weak, but determination burning in her eyes. She could see the enemy now emerging from the dunes, distant shapes, moving methodically and yet slowly approaching, a sniper hidden atop a ridge. Eyes locked on the surviving squad members. The fire from the IED still smoldering around them, smoke curling like fingers trying to claim the desert. Harper knew that if she did nothing more than wait, they would all be dead, and she forced herself to think through the pain. Her hands clawed at the sand. She felt the heat of the ground pressing against her arms, dragging herself forward every inch, and agony muscles. Screaming, but her mind focusing only on the radios, the laser designator, the one thing that could call in support and save her team. She gritted her teeth, blood mixing with dust as she managed to turn her body toward the faint glint of metal half. Buried beneath a rock, the radio, she could see it through the smoke, but the distance seemed insurmountable, every movement sending shocks of pain through her body. She whispered to herself, "For my team, for them." She began to inch forward. Bullets began, striking nearby sand, exploding into clouds around her, forcing her to duck lower, using whatever debris she could find as cover. She assessed the positions of the enemies, the firing patterns, the blind spots, the dips in the sand. She counted the seconds between bursts, measuring them in her mind, trying to find the path to the radio. Every movement calculated, despite the screaming pain, the sounds of her teammates fighting for their lives echoing through the haze. She knew she had no choice. She could not wait for someone else to save them. She was all they had, and every second mattered. Her body burned with every drag. She lost track of time. The sun climbing higher, the heat unbearable. She could feel sand sliding beneath her hands, cutting in two. Skin already raw with burns and abrasions, she forced herself to focus on the small patch of metal in the distance, the radio glowing faintly, catching the sun. She remembered her training, the countless drills crawling across mock battlefields, the Hours of memorizing coordinates and signals, every lesson now flashing through her mind, she pressed forward. Each inch gained a triumph in agony, but the distance still seemed too great. The enemy still advancing, slowly closing in. She thought of her team pinned behind rocks, some unable to move, others trying to return fire, knowing they depended on her. She whispered their names, imagining their faces one by one, urging herself forward through the haze of pain, through the smoke, through the blinding light of fire. The sand stuck to her blood and sweat, creating a paste on her arms. She gritted her teeth and refused to stop. She felt her fingers scrape across sharp rock. But she did not care. She had to reach the radio. She had to guide. The airstrike, she had to save them, and every movement seemed like an eternity. A shadow moved across the ridge. She looked up, barely able to raise her head, her vision swimming, seeing the outline of a sniper about to fire. She froze, calculating how. To move her body without exposing herself, she shifted slightly, using her elbows to push forward, hiding behind a chunk of debris. The sound of a distant explosion reminded her how close death had come already. She dared not cry. She dared not scream, only to move, only to survive, only to reach the radio that glinted faintly, still too far, but within reach. If she could just hold on, she gritted her teeth and whispered it again for my team and dragged herself forward, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fire, ignoring the enemy closing in. The smoke thickened around her, the sound of shouts and gunfire blending into a single roar in her ears. She could feel her strength fading, her arms shaking uncontrollably, each drag a battle against herself and the desert. She could see the faint shimmer of the radio now closer than before, but every movement made her wince and cry out in agony. She knew she had to keep going. She could not stop. She could not fail her team. Every heartbeat a drum of survival, every breath a reminder that the enemy would not wait. And she whispered under her breath just a little farther, and in the distance a new sound rose, a low hum, the promise of reinforcements perhaps, but she could not be sure. And she knew. She had to reach the radio before anything else happened. The sand burned her hands. Her arms trembled, her body battered and broken. She pushed forward inch by inch, ignoring screams and explosions, ignoring the world collapsing around her, her eyes fixed on the small metal glint catching the sun. She felt a hand of hope reaching out, even as the enemy crept closer. Her mind raced, calculating the path, the shots, the cover, and the distance, each movement a battle between life and death, and just as she thought she might collapse from exhaustion and pain, she saw the first real gap of open sand between her and the radio, a fleeting moment, a chance to reach it. But the enemy, noticing the movement, raised their weapons and fired, and she realized she had to act now, or everything would be lost. Her hands dug into the sand. She propelled herself forward. The radio only a few meters away now, every ounce of strength focused on those last few feet, the sound of bullets striking the ground near, her head sand flying into her eyes, blinding her. She gritted her teeth and moved faster, ignoring pain that threatened to overwhelm her, ignoring the cries of her teammates that spurred her on. Finally, she stretched her arm and her fingers brushed. Against the metal, she clutched it with a growl of effort and pulled herself forward just as an explosion erupted near her hiding place, sending debris into the air, and she realized that reaching the radio was only the beginning of the fight. She had survived the crawl, but now she had to use it and guide the airstrike while the enemy was still advancing and her legs were still crushed and the battlefield was still alive with death and danger. The radio hummed faintly beneath her fingers, its buttons and dials foreign yet familiar. From countless drills and training, her vision blurred with sweat and tears, her body trembling and burning from the crawl. She pressed her lips to the microphone and whispered coordinates, her voice shaky. But firm, she could see the enemy closing in, their rifles glinting in the sun, the shouts of her teammates echoing across the desert. the smell of smoke and blood thick in the air, every second stretching like an eternity. She knew that if she failed, now the team would be lost, and she would never forgive herself. Pain radiated from her legs through her torso, every heartbeat sending shocks of agony that made her gasp. But she forced herself to focus, her hands shaking as she adjusted the dials, giving precise grid references for the incoming airstrike. She could hear the hum of aircraft in the distance, a faint roar growing louder, and she whispered corrections, calling out targets, watching the smoke rise from explosions hitting the enemy. Lines her mind a battlefield of memory and instinct. Every movement a calculation, balancing her own survival against the lives of the soldiers pinned down around her. She could see Corporal James waving frantically from behind a sand dune. He was injured but still trying to cover the squad. She called his name, urging him to move slowly back towards safer ground, guiding him with her words. Every shout of her teammates urging her to retreat or hide ignored. She had to stay on the radio. She had to continue the strike. She could see the first group of enemy combatants falling to the ground under the precision strikes. She gave the coordinates, her fingers gripping the device until the knuckles whitened. She knew she had bought her team a chance, but the fire was not over. The enemy still held positions that threatened the retreat. The sand burned her arms and palms. She could feel her blood mixing with dust and sweat, every muscle trembling, her body screaming for rest, and yet she remained focused. The first waves of explosions scattering the enemy, forcing them to regroup. She saw them moving through the dunes, trying to flank her position. Bullets whistling past her head, the radio shaking in her hands. She adjusted quickly, calling in another strike. Every order a gamble, balancing life and death. She felt the desert pressing down on her, as if the earth itself weighed on her chest. The sky above shimmering with heat and smoke, making it hard to see yet. She could not let her vision blur. She had to guide every shot. Her team slowly began to move, retreating towards safer cover. Each movement guided by her commands. She could hear the cries of injured men, the moans of the wounded mixing with the harsh shouts of the enemy, the sand beneath her burning her skin, her arms trembling from exhaustion and pain. She clenched her teeth, forcing the words through her lips, every syllable, a lifeline, every instruction, a hope that someone would survive. She could feel time stretching, the seconds endless. Her mind calculating the trajectory of every strike, the timing of every burst of fire, the position of every soldier alive or injured on the ground. A sudden flash lit the horizon, an explosion closer. Then, before throwing sand and debris across her vision, she twisted to avoid shrapnel. The device rattling in her hands, the hum of incoming aircraft now deafening as she yelled coordinates, correcting for the blast, forcing the enemy back. She could see a few of them pinned behind rocks, their rifles still raised, their eyes wide with fear as the explosions shook the ground around them. She pressed forward, her arms dragging her body a few more inches, each movement a victory over the desert and the pain that sought to claim her. Her body burned with each command, the muscles spasming, the nerves screaming. She could feel blood trickling down her sides from old shrapnel wounds. Every inhale a dagger, every exhale a battle against unconsciousness. She glanced at the distance, seeing the outline of enemy mortars, the radio feeding her position. She adjusted, giving new coordinates, shouting until her voice cracked the air, thick with dust and smoke, each strike now bringing the enemy closer to collapse, but the danger still pressing in, bullets ricocheting around her. Every shadow a threat she could not ignore. She thought of her family, of her training, her team relying on her, and the promise she had made silently to herself that she would not fail. She remembered Daniel and her fallen comrades, their faces flashing before her eyes, urging her forward through the pain. She could hear Corporal James calling out coordinates back to her, reporting enemy movement. She adjusted quickly, giving precise locations, each order saving lives but exposing herself more. The desert now a swirling chaos of fire and dust and bullets, and every step forward in her mind, counting the cost of each second. Another explosion rocked the ground, throwing Her to one side, sand filling her mouth, her ears ringing. She could see the enemy regrouping behind a ridge, trying to prepare another assault. She crawled closer, gripping the radio. Pressing her face near the microphone, she gave precise targeting. Information guiding the airstrike over and over, shouting corrections. Her voice raw from the effort, she could feel her body failing, yet she could not stop. She had to protect them. She could see the smoke rising from enemy positions, her team now, moving steadily toward cover but still in danger, the horizon dark with the threat of the remaining fighters. Her breaths came ragged, gasping for air, her arms trembling uncontrollably. She shifted her weight inch by inch, trying to keep the device. Steady every order, a lifeline, every calculation, saving lives. She glanced at the remaining enemy combatants, a few stragglers attempting to flank the squad. She pressed her lips to the microphone, calling in precise coordinates, adjusting as explosions. Tore through the sand around them, she could see the impact of each strike, but knew the final positions still remained threatening. She felt herself fading, slipping in and out of awareness, but each time forcing herself back to the radio. The team moved steadily, following her guidance toward relative safety. Every shout of acknowledgement from her teammates fueling her determination. Despite the agony in her crushed legs, the burns on her arms, the wounds in her side. She continued giving coordinates, adjusting the fire, calling out the positions of every enemy soldier, every sand dune, every shadow. The air thick with smoke, the desert echoing with shouts and explosions, the radio shaking in her hands as she forced herself to remain conscious and aware, knowing that if she faltered even for a moment, her team could be lost, and she could never forgive herself. The sun climbed higher, the heat unbearable, the radio still humming in her hands, the enemy regrouping, trying to mount another offensive. She could see them tightening their formation across the dunes, her voice shaking from exhaustion but steady in command, shouting coordinates, calling in air support again and again. She could see the impacts scattering the enemy, each strike a chance for her team to survive the desert. Now a storm of dust and fire bullets ricocheting nearby, every movement sending waves of pain through her body. She forced herself to stay focused, knowing she must continue until every threat was neutralized or until she could no longer hold on. Her hands bleeding her arms, trembling every muscle screaming. She continued to call out targeting information, directing the airstrike with every ounce of remaining strength. She could feel the heat of explosions. Around her, the cries of her team urging her on, her body almost spent, yet refusing to give in. She could see the last enemy stronghold, a ridge fortified by sandbags and rocks. She pressed herself closer to the device, giving final coordinates, knowing this strike could save them all or cost her life. As the aircraft roared overhead, she whispered, "Just hold on," and watched as the desert itself seemed to tremble under the fury of the bombs, knowing the real battle had only just begun, and the enemy had yet to be completely destroyed. The desert burned under the relentless sun, sand shimmering like fire on the horizon. Harper lay on her stomach, arms trembling, clutching the radio as sweat and blood mixed on her skin. Her legs crushed beneath her, unable to move, every breath a battle, every heartbeat a hammering drum of pain and fear. The roar of aircraft above filled the air as she shouted coordinates, the explosions painting the sand with smoke and fire, her voice hoarse from hours of strain. Yet every word precise, every instruction a lifeline for the soldiers behind cover, scrambling toward relative safety. Corporal James waved from a ridge, his uniform torn and smeared with dirt and blood, his rifle dangling loosely in one hand. He ducked, behind a chunk of debris, returning fire as best he could, his eyes locked on Harper and the radio, knowing she was their only chance to survive. She called out his movements, correcting his path, urging him to keep low to avoid the sniper still perched. In the distant dunes, she could see the muzzle flashes and hear the faint click of the enemy rifles as they fired. She ignored the pain and screamed coordinates, forcing the airstrike to adjust each hit, scattering the enemy and giving her team precious seconds to move forward. The explosions shook the ground around her, throwing sand and debris into the air. Her arms scraped against sharp rocks as she shifted her weight inch by inch, dragging herself closer to a small rise that offered partial cover. She felt every nerve in her body screaming the pain from her crushed legs, radiating up through her torso, every movement sending waves of agony. But she could not stop. She had to continue. She had to guide the strikes. She had to save them. Her team depended on her, and she could not fail them. The desert around her seemed alive with death, and she could feel it watching each twitch of muscle, each shallow breath. Smoke from the first waves of airstrikes rose into the sky, twisting and curling in the heat. She could see the enemy regrouping, attempting to flank the remaining squad members, bullets striking nearby sand, exploding like firecrackers. She called out new coordinates, giving precise measurements, adjusting for the shifting positions of the enemy. She could see her teammates moving methodically, following her instructions every second, a gamble, every breath, a calculated risk. Her hands burned from holding the radio steady, her fingers numb and bleeding, yet she refused to drop it, knowing if she did, the team would be slaughtered. A sudden explosion rocked the ridge nearest her, sending her sprawling into a small trench, sand filling her mouth and ears, ringing her vision blurred for a moment. She pressed her face to the radio and continued shouting instructions, each word carrying the weight of their lives. The enemy still advancing through the dunes, trying to reach the squad. She could hear them grunting and shouting orders. She visualized the map in her head, every dune, every shadow, every crevice, adjusting coordinates, calling in the airstrike, forcing the bombs to find the targets before her friends could be overrun. Her arms shook violently with fatigue, every inch forward a battle of will over body. Every movement, a war against pain and exhaustion. She remembered the drills, the countless hours training for moments like this. Every lesson burning in her mind, she visualized each soldier she had trained, with each team member counting on her every coordinate, a lifeline, every adjustment, a prayer. She could see the sniper still aiming for her position, the glint of the barrel catching sunlight. She cursed under her breath and shifted her body, forcing herself forward, ignoring the screams of pain that threatened to overwhelm her. The desert now a storm of dust and fire, each explosion sending shockwaves through the sand. She could feel her arms trembling uncontrollably, the radio vibrating in her hands, bullets striking nearby, creating clouds of sand. She used them as cover, adjusting her body inch by inch, each movement calculated. Despite the agony, the screams of her teammates mingling with the roar of aircraft and distant gunfire, she could see James helping wounded soldiers, dragging them toward relative cover. She called out directions, coordinating every movement. She could see the relief in their faces, knowing she had bought them seconds to survive. Time blurred into a haze of pain and chaos, the sun climbing higher, her body burning from exertion and injuries. She adjusted the radio for the final wave of strikes, the enemy still entrenched in a ridge of sandbags and rocks, forcing her team to remain pinned. She calculated trajectories, adjusted for wind and elevation, shouted coordinates, her voice cracking with fatigue, yet every word precise, her arms quivering, her hands numb and raw. She could feel the desert pressing down on her, every sense alert, every nerve straining to keep the squad alive. She remembered her family, her training, her comrades who had fallen in previous missions, their faces a haunting chorus, urging her to continue. She could see the last of the enemy positions crouched. Behind dunes, rifles raised, waiting for a chance to strike. She pressed herself closer to the radio, her face near the microphone, shouting instructions, adjusting strikes, correcting trajectories, every explosion moving them closer to safety, every call a measure of survival. Her body burning, every movement agony but refusing to quit. Corporal James called out, "Enemy movement." She shouted corrections, adjusting the coordinates, guiding the airstrike as explosions ripped through the sand around them. She could see the impact scattering the enemy, forcing them back. She could feel herself fading, slipping in and out of consciousness, yet forcing herself back to the radio. Every shout, a lifeline, every adjustment keeping her team alive, bullets. Ricocheting nearby, sand and dust coating her hair and skin, she gritted her teeth and pushed herself forward, knowing if she faltered even for a second her team could die. The horizon shimmered with heat and smoke, the enemy regrouping, attempting. One last push. Her team moving steadily under her guidance. She shouted coordinates, correcting for the shift in position. Every word, a desperate lifeline, the radio vibrating with each transmission, explosions, rocking the desert around her. She could see the last stronghold fortified with sandbags and rocks, her hands bleeding, her arms trembling from exhaustion. Yet she pressed on, giving final instructions, guiding the airstrike to obliterate the remaining enemy positions, her body screaming for rest. But her mind fixed only on the survival of those relying on her. Minutes stretched like hours, the desert echoing with shouts, explosions and gunfire, the squad now moving in relative safety. Following her directions, she called out one final wave of strikes, pinpointing every target, adjusting trajectories as aircraft roared overhead. The enemy positions collapsing under the precision of her instructions. She could feel her body failing, muscles spasming, nerves screaming, pain radiating from every wound, yet she could not stop. She had to continue guiding until the threat was eliminated, until the squad reached cover, until every life she could save was out of the reach of the enemy, her arms shaking uncontrollably, the radio still. In her hands, bullets ricocheting around her, every shadow. A threat. She continued shouting. Coordinates, adjusting strikes, watching the impact of every bomb, her body trembling from pain and exhaustion. She could see the squad moving behind cover toward safety. Every word, a lifeline. Every call, a prayer. The desert alive with fire and death around her. She pushed herself forward inch by inch, knowing that if she stopped now, everything could be lost and the enemy could reclaim the advantage. She gritted her teeth and whispered just a little longer, just a little farther, guiding every strike until the last enemy position fell and her team was safe, but she still could not move. Only press on. Harper lay against the hot sand, her body trembling, every muscle screaming from the hours of crawling and dragging herself through the desert, pain radiating from her crushed legs up through her torso and arms. Yet she clutched the radio tightly, guiding the final coordinates for the airstrike. Each word, a lifeline for her team. The roar of aircraft above mingling with the distant shouts of soldiers scrambling toward cover, explosions, throwing clouds of sand and smoke into the air. Her vision blurred, but her focus sharp, every instruction precise, every adjustment keeping her comrades alive. Corporal James waved from a nearby ridge, dragging the wounded with him, his uniform torn and smeared with blood and dust. He shouted for her to keep directing the strike, and she responded over the radio. Shouting coordinates over and over, every syllable, a desperate lifeline. She could see the enemy still attempting to regroup behind dunes and rocks. But each strike she guided forced them back inch by inch, scattering them and giving her team precious seconds to reach safer ground, the desert around them, alive with fire and bullets, and the screams of men fighting for survival. Her arms burned, her hands raw from gripping the device, the muscles trembling uncontrollably, yet she pressed on inch by inch, dragging herself forward, using rocks and debris for cover. Every movement agony, every breath a battle. Her mind focused only on the survival of the squad. The aircraft above responding to her commands, each bomb hitting with deadly precision. She could see the last enemy stronghold beginning to crumble, and she whispered just a little longer, just a little farther, knowing that if she stopped even now, the team could still be in danger, and she could not let that happen. The desert fell into an eerie silence, the echoes of explosions fading into the hot air. Harper lay on the sand, her body trembling uncontrollably, every muscle screaming from exhaustion and pain, her arms raw from gripping the radio for hours, her legs crushed and unresponsive, yet she could see her team moving steadily toward cover. Her instructions having guided them through the chaos, her heart pounding as relief and agony collided in her chest. She pressed the radio to her lips, giving one last series of coordinates ensuring the final enemy positions were destroyed, each word precise, every syllable, a lifeline keeping 40 lives from being lost. Corporal James reached her side, helping to support her upper body, his hands steadying hers. He shouted encouragement over the roar of distant aircraft. She nodded through gritted teeth, urging him to keep moving, the wounded following closely behind her guidance. She could see their faces etched with fear, exhaustion, and determination. Every step a testament to the precision of her instructions. The enemy now scattered or neutralized, their rifles silent, the dunes around them smoking and scarred from the airstrike. She allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, letting the knowledge that her team was alive wash over her. Medics arrived, quickly assessing her injuries, their faces grim but professional. They carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. She felt every jolt of the sand under the wheels, every movement sending shocks of pain through her body. Yet she remained focused on her team, ensuring they reached safety without incident. She could see the gratitude in their eyes, the silent nods of respect from those she had guided and protected, every action she had taken burning into their memory, a testament to courage, determination, and selflessness under fire. As the helicopter lifted her from the desert floor, she looked down at the squad, safe behind cover, their silhouettes, small against the vast landscape, yet alive and moving. Toward medical aid, her mind replayed every second of the crawl, the airstrikes, the screams and shouts, the relentless pain that had threatened to claim her life. She realized that it had been her willpower and refusal to quit that had allowed her to survive and protect her team. She whispered softly, "Just hold on, just a little longer." Hours later in the field hospital, her body stabilized but battered. She lay quietly listening to the distant hum of desert winds and the soft voices of medics. Around her, she knew the story of this day would be told and retold. Not for glory, but for the courage and sacrifice it had demanded. 40 lives, saved by determination, grit, and unwavering focus. Her eyes closed briefly, a sense of peace washing over her, knowing she had faced impossible odds and emerged a hero. Yet the memory of the desert and the cost of survival would never fully leave her. It lingered in every ache, every scar, and every breath she drew.